So welcome to this, what might sound like a very bizarre statement, Taste the Planets presentation. So my name is Gary O'Toole. You can find me at timelinaastrology.com. And basically, this concept of rasa, of taste, goes far beyond, obviously, the actual tastes in terms of foods, that we actually literally taste life. And we can link the taste to our experience of life as well. And when we see that in the astrology, as I'll show you, it has a profound impact on our mental, emotional, spiritual well-being, really. And it's all dependent on our basic setup. So in our birth chart, we all have a birth chart. We all were born with a certain karmic, quote unquote, imprint. And that is either balanced or imbalanced according to certain tastes. And you know that from your Ayurveda training. The people who are here who study Ayurveda know that well in terms of the actual medicinal side of it. But in terms of the actual more psychosomatic, you might say, or spiritual side of it, in terms of the astrology, it also has a big impact. And in a way, it actually has a bigger impact in one way, because it's quite obvious when you taste something, when you eat something, or when you experience something, that has an impact. You can sense that pretty much quickly. And I know some people don't, but most people are going to say you're going to have a taste of something and you sense how that is having an effect, especially if you are studying such. But not many people, or not as many people on the planet, understand astrology in terms of their life experience in that sense, being literally like tasting certain planets. So the concept is obviously going into a bit more, I guess, theoretical and philosophical notions of the fact that we have subtle bodies beyond our physical body, a more obvious physical body, or our energy body, our emotional body. We have a causal body, or an imprint, a spiritual imprint, you might say. So it's the planets communicate with that part of us, if you want to call it, quote unquote, part of us. They don't directly communicate with us. And why any of us study astrology is that we want to be more in tune with that imprint, so that we can recognize, why do I keep doing that thing? Why do I keep attracting that thing? Why do I have that experience over and over again? So it's just understanding it from that kind of subtler imprint. The subtler something is, the more powerful it is, essentially, is what I'm saying. So that's why astrology is so powerful. So before we get into this in any way in terms of the astrology, let's chant a little bit for Ganesh. So this is a deity. This is the ruler of Vedic astrology. We'll chant this very simple Om Gang Ganapataye Namah mantra, and we'll do it 12 times, one for each sign of the zodiac. It might help us tune in. I always do this, but it's always worth mentioning. Just a note on pronunciation. The gum is pronounced like G-U-M usually. But because it's followed by a G, then you have to pronounce the M to the back of the throat. So when you pronounce an M to the back of the throat, it sounds more like ung, as in O-N-G. If you were to try that yourself, it would be So it's Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. So we'll chant it 12 times, and it's a good practice to do, I think, generally, just to clear the mind. Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. 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 So this is another mantra that I put in as a really useful one in terms of health, especially. So this is a mantra that my teacher Pearl Finn used to always advise us to chant if we have any difficulties. It's specifically because in Vedic mantras they specify the meter, the amount of syllables that are in the mantra correlates with a certain aspect of our life. So this has 6 syllables, and that relates to the 6th house of astrology, which represents ill health. So it's in a way of kind of channeling the 6th house and making a more positive thing, because the 6th house, we'll talk about it more, but the 6th house is both our illness, our weakness, and also ultimately our strength, because the 6th house is where the siddhis, the powers, are also seen. So it's like, as anyone who has overcome an illness knows, that it makes you focus on the more powerful aspect. It's like just improving your health practically. You just feel like, oh, I've overcome this illness, this challenge, and helping others do so as well is another part of that. But this mantra, Hare Rama Krishna, this 6-syllable mantra, not just invoking the 6th house, but also Buddhi, Kala, and Indriyartha. Basically, these represent the ascendant, the sun, and the moon. And the ascendant relates to Jupiter also. And so these, Jupiter, sun, and moon, and the ascendant, especially sun and moon, are really important in terms of health and starting points. So Buddhi, of course, is intelligence as well, and the ascendant represents intelligence. People get confused about this because they think the ascendant is the body only, and the body is not, it's not the only thing represented by the ascendant, but the body has its own intelligence. So the body intelligently reacts to every single moment, every single day. If it's cold, it reacts. If it's warm, it reacts. If you eat something, it reacts instantaneously. And there's no sort of mind input like putting in on that usually. It's doing it on its own involuntarily, right? So there's an intelligence there. So that's Buddhi, that's the ascendant, that's also Jupiter. Kala then refers to more so the sun, Rama. So Hare, then there's Rama, the sun. And Rama is the Vishnu avatar of the sun. So Rama and the sun energy, and it's a very powerful mantra to actually chant, just Rama on its own, for invigorating ourselves. But it relates more specifically, the sun, to time, Kala, so the passing of time. And then the Indriyarthas, this is related to the moon, and Krishna is the avatar, the Vishnu avatar of the moon. And it's very much to do with our senses and our sense of enjoyment also. So those 3, Buddhi, Kala, and Indriyartha, simply chanting Hare Rama Krishna and just chanting it over and over activates these really important, powerful points in our chart, what are called the Sudarshan chakra, the sun, moon, ascendant, but also that 6th house. And so if you've got any 6th house problems, any addictions, any ill health, any weaknesses, any challenges that you're trying to overcome, chanting this very simple 6-syllable mantra is the one to go to. So Hare Rama Krishna. Okay, so let's get into some of the astrology. So you have you're familiar with this, the Prakriti and the Vikriti, and, our constitution from birth, but then there's also how that changes throughout our life, the Vikriti. So the constitution is impacted by what I'm going to talk about here later on in the second half of this, and that is the daśās. These are the way that your birth chart are progressed through time, because obviously you were born and you have a constitution from birth. You're familiar with that. But that changes throughout time as we get older, but not just getting older, but moving through time in terms of the seasons every year, in the day, and also in these particular daśās that are called what we could translate as circumstances based on our particular blueprint, our birth chart. And that's how basically we progress the chart. We do it with transits also, but that's like a secondary thing almost to the daśās. And oftentimes you'll only hear about transits in astrology, but in Indian astrology, they emphasize daśās more. So it's sign progressions or planetary progressions, but it's all about moving your chart along. You're not, 10 years old anymore, or maybe not 20, 30, 40, you move through life. And as that's happening, transits are triggering things also. So both are relevant. So that's Prakriti and Vikriti. So this is more to do with Prakriti. This is kind of probably, for some people who know all of this already, is really boring. But let me just quickly whiz through it. So this is from my book, Cosmic Bodies. These are by John Corrigan. He's an illustrator, and he did this for me. And I think they really show the different body types, mind body types really well. So you have the Vata, the air type. Wind type probably would be, I'm using wind these days more than air. Wind because it's about movement, and it's, symbol is the snake, and that's not lost on astrologers because the North Node Rahu is symbolized by the serpents. So Saturn, Rahu, and the new moon, the dark moon, are seen as more airy vata in nature. And so if they are very prominently placed in your birth chart, then that means in particular places, that means that you will be more of this air type. So that's the vata type. Just move things around here. So the next one then is the pitta type, and bounding like the frog, even in terms of the pulse. The snake pulse, the very slithering, that's the vata. This is the bounding pulse, the pulsating pitta type, the fiery types. It means that in your birth chart, if you're very pitta, you have to have the sun, Mars, and the south node of the moon opposite the north node, Ketu. All of these have to be really prominent in your chart to be if you're pitta. And also we can get into this, but the difference between the sun and Mars, for example, is the difference between more balanced, maybe what you call it sattvic pitta, heat, and that's energizing and invigorating and brings vitality, that's the sun, versus the Mars pitta, which is like a toxic pitta, like a tamas pitta, which is like toxins, literally. So it depends really, as well, where on that you are. And then the third type is the kapha, the water type. If you're kapha type, you have to have Venus, Jupiter, and the full moon very prominent in your birth chart. As above, so below. So again, we can just think of astrology as just a map of what you're already looking at. Whether you use your palm, as in palmistry, or you use your star signs, your birth chart as a map, you're just seeing what you see with your eyes, your physical body, and other people's. This is why Ayurvedic doctors in ancient times were also Jyotishi, were also astrologers. So it's an important thing to consider. And why that would be helpful as well is not just from diagnosing something or someone, but also timing it, which we'll get into later on. This is, like I said, the kapha type, water type, the swan, the very graceful type. So those are the three types. I just want to mention the subdivisions of vata because they're so important. And I just want to, again, bring in the astrology. Every slide I'm going to show you here is going to have an astrological some consideration or other. I mean, otherwise, I'm just going to be telling, the class what they already know. I'm not going to go into the basics of Ayurveda. I'm going to go into the astrology if that's helpful. So the subdivisions of vata, you have the prana, obviously the energizing inward moving wind. You have the udana, the upward moving. You have the vayana. This is the vyana, that's the circulating, the samana, and the equalizing, and the apana, downward. So these correlate with the planets. Prana correlates with Jupiter and the element of space, as we will see that Jupiter rules the element of space. Udana represents the upward moving air, and Saturn, which itself correlates with the element of air. Vyana circulating the moon and Venus, both, and water would correlate with that. But again, it depends whether the moon is new or full. A new moon, remember, is more airy, and a full moon more watery. So that depends. But Venus most certainly rules primarily water. Samana is equalizing the sun and Mars, and the element is fire. And again, the sun here in one way, and the moon in one way, but the sun and moon are beyond the elements in another way. So Mars represents fire, Venus water, but the sun is not just fire, it's soul, right? And the moon is not just water, it's mind. So they're different kind of beyond element aspects, really. And then finally, the apana, this is the downward moving air, and it correlates more with the earth. How grounded do you feel? How balanced are you in terms of this air would be seen in your Mercury. How is Mercury in your birth chart? When someone has a very exalted Mercury, they're very practical, grounded people. When someone has an exalted sun, they're very fiery and inspired people. If someone has a very powerful Mars, their fire might be more on the toxic side. If someone has an exalted, powerful moon, they're very watery and loving people, a very affectionate type of person, as well as Venus. Saturn, if it's very powerful, in the case of Saturn and Mars in particular, these two, they're termed cruel planets in Indian astrology. So they can be cruel, but it's almost like being cruel to be kind. So Saturn, if it's very strong, it can be cruel. And that is the primary planet for disease in Ayurveda. So, of course, Vata is the primary governing dosha and relates to disease. So Saturn will have a big say in how well someone is, depending on its position, how strong it is, what it's doing in the chart. And everybody has an illness. Everyone has an imbalance somewhere. And wherever Saturn is, that's where it's going to show up primarily. And then finally, Jupiter, where everything is held together in space, is that the overall and governing prana, and Jupiter kind of is the overall governing everything. It holds everything in place. In space, literally. So it rules the space element. A lot of people say ether, but one of my teachers would have said, no, space is a better description. But I mean, I guess it's tomato, tomato in another way. So let's get into the signs a bit. And I will be taking questions as well, and we'll break and all of that, and we'll do some case studies. So there's plenty of opportunity to ask about this. And remember, it's being recorded. So if all of this is going in one ear and out the other ear, that's okay. Because you can let it sit, whatever sits today, and then let the rest go. Don't overburden your mind with any of this. So the signs of the zodiac, this is the South Indian, which I prefer, the box style. And the reason I prefer it is because you can very quickly see what's opposite what and what looks at what. And that's important because this is a map of life, essentially. The astrology, of course, is a map of life, but this is a map of how energies activate or stagnate or balance each other. And so that is represented in the movable, fixed, and dual signs in this order. Movable, Aries, Taurus, fixed, Gemini, dual. Another way of saying that is active, inert, balanced, or Rajas, Tamas, Sattva. So this is a very simple way. This is a very simple way of looking at it, and it goes a lot more nuanced than this. But just to start there, the four corners are the dual signs, and that's why I like this South Indian style, because you can very quickly see the four corners and know that anything in any of the four corners influences anything in the other four corners. So if you're born in anything in any of the dual signs, Pisces, Gemini, Virgo, or Sagittarius, it's going to impact the others. And there's a truism that, when we're in balance, we seek things that further promote that balance. But if we're out of balance, we'll seek things that keep us out of balance. So we can think about it that way as well. What is going on in the four corners is going to have a big impact on our lifestyle as well. Then the active signs influence the fixed signs and vice versa, except the ones adjacent. So here you'll see the four corners, but then you'll see these two signs, Aries, Taurus, beside each other. They don't look at each other. You see Cancer and Leo don't look at each other, and Libra, Scorpio, as well as Capricorn and Aquarius. These don't look at each other, but they look at the other signs that are opposite their nature. In other words, Aries is active, it's movable, it's Rajas, it's fiery, it likes to move. It looks at the fixed signs, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, and wants to get them moving too. And likewise, these fixed signs, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, look back at Aries, because the fixed signs also look at the active signs and want to slow them down. So basically, again, Ayurvedically speaking, if you're hyper, you need to take something that's going to slow you down. If you're too dull, you need to take something that's going to stimulate you. And ideally, and even in our activities, we want a balance of both, which is the four corners, the sattvic signs. So that's a very simple way, though, of looking at it. It gets a lot more nuanced than that, but I just thought I'd throw it in there now. And here, let's get to planets, because all of those signs are, how we experience life in one way, but it's really the planets that are the characters in our life, the parts of our being that express themselves in different ways through the signs, more so. So the signs are either in a strength, or they're moving towards a weakness, or because the thing is, even if you see a list here of debilitation, that sounds like a bad word. And it's 0% strength. So if you've got a planet that's 0% strength, like if you've got the sun in Libra, and especially around 10 degrees of Libra, there's a weakness there. There's an inherent weakness with the sun. But the thing is that it's usually, and I think I heard a figure like 80-something% of the time, it's mitigated by other factors, 80-something% of the time. So don't just think that, oh, I've got a planet in a weak place, therefore that's it. No, there's often, and usually most of the time, a mitigating factor. So don't worry about that. But it does mean, though, that there is an inherent weakness that you have to work on, and it's likely that you have worked on it and then have made it strong, and maybe even stronger than it would have been otherwise. So don't just take debilitation as bad and 0% as really bad. It can be really good. And I can show you enough charts of people with Mars in Cancer, for example, who are pro athletes. As an example, like Mars is very sort of gung-ho, fiery energy. And you think Mars in Cancer, debilitated, 0% strength, how on earth does somebody become a pro athlete? And the fact is that they have come from a place of weakness and they're proving themselves. And they get stronger than they would have otherwise. So never take debilitation as simply bad, or never take exaltation as simply good, because that might not be good. For example, I mentioned Saturn. Saturn exalted in Libra. I can tell you enough stories about people with Saturn in Libra who have a challenge with Saturn. It's very powerful, but it means that you have to overcome the challenges that Saturn is bringing forth, and air type of challenges, Vata indications are the case with Saturn. So you can have a look at that list. And again, I've sent the notes, and I can send more notes as well. There's endless amount of notes if you want to get into this more and more. But these are the planets, their exaltation, debilitation. Root strength is another concept where they do really well in, maybe in a way better than any other sign, even exaltation. Because when you have an exalted planet, it could be that actually it's taken out in another way. There's an exaltation, and then that's hampered by something else. So it's better, in fact, to actually have it in its root strength or its own sign. So the sun rules Leo, the moon rules Cancer, Mars rules Aries and Scorpio, Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, Jupiter rules Sagittarius, Pisces, Venus, Taurus, Libra, and Saturn, Capricorn, Aquarius. So we'll get more into this when we look at case studies. And then the most important, really, I would say, in terms of tasting the planets, in terms of rasa, is actually below that, in a sense, or deeper within that, is the sense of impulse. And where does that impulse come from? Again, I mentioned it at the beginning that it's not a direct communication line between us and the planets. That's quite obvious, because if it were, everybody would be very clear about what's going on and they would just manage it really well. Most people don't manage it really well because they have no idea that the planets in any way influence them. And let's face it, astrologers don't have any idea of how the planets influence them. And there's a modern day kind of like conversation going on in astrology circles. Do the planets have a direct kind of influence on us, or is it just a map in the heavens? So you have this kind of sort of these two sides of the sort of story, and that astrologers can't even agree on, or most astrologers, I would say, in this day and age, talk about astrology as only a map. That's it. And in ancient Vedic times, that's not how they saw it at all. It also was seen as this direct link energetically to us. And like I said, it's not directly to our physical or even mental, emotional body. Its imprint is much deeper than that, much, much deeper. So this is where you have to talk about gunas. So there are 3 gunas. They are really the underpinning modes of all things, and everything we experience, a mood, a food, a shape, a form, a life experience, every single thing we have, every single moment of every day is highlighted by a ratio of these 3. Rajas, Tamas, Sattva. Again, reflected in all those signs. Again, this is very general, but like the Rajas signs, as I mentioned, are the active signs. And the planets you can include here also are Mercury and Venus. They're more agitated. Mercury and Venus represent our desires. When someone's in a cycle of Mercury or Venus, they have a lot of desires. And because when we're younger, we're in a cycle of Mercury and Venus in a general sense. Everybody is. In our teens, into our 20s and 30s, these are the Mercury-Venus type years. And so that's why anyone I have, come for a reading when they're younger, it's all Mercury-Venus related things. It's with their desires. It's all about what they want out of life. It's a relationship they want. It's a job they want. Venus's relationship, Mercury's job. I'm not saying that people, older or younger don't think about these things, but it's primarily kicks in teens, 20s. This is Mercury and Venus. Tamas then, like I said, the fixed signs would reflect this more so. especially Scorpio and Aquarius, which for reasons we'll get to, because of the rulership, the planets that rule these. But all the fixed signs and the planets Saturn and Mars and the lunar nodes, because they are literally eclipses, so they're shadows. So that's the quality of tamas. It's dark, it's inert, it's not clear. So if you know that from your Ayurveda training, you can apply that here. Then finally, the sattva is the more balanced, the four corners of the chart I mentioned, the jewel signs, but also we can bring in that 3 Hari Rama Krishna, the Jupiter, the Sun, and Moon. So they are the 3 gunas in terms of how they express themselves. Let me show you another. I have graph or a table upon table upon table. There's no shortage. So just again, take what you want to absorb today and then just let the rest go. And, you know, you're at home possibly or in the room there. You can just walk around, get yourself a cup of tea. You know, you can just chill. You are not tied to a chair here looking at a professor at the top of a classroom. I'm chill. You're chill. You can go around and do whatever you need to do. So just kind of recap in a way as well of what these qualities are for each of the planets. So I'll give you their Sanskrit names as well. So Sun, Surya, the Graha is Surya. It's sattva in nature, but it's also pitta. So I mentioned that. So it tends to, especially when it's strong in a person's chart, bring really good health, really robust health. If it's weak, it doesn't mean, again, debilitation is weak. It could be mitigated by other factors. But if it is weak, then the person, you know, might not feel that. So the moon then is sattvic also, and vata or kapha, depending. And again, depending on whether it's a new moon that's vata or a full moon kapha. So depending on whether you're born on a new or full moon. And if you're born on a full moon, you're going to be more kapha in general, especially if it's impacting your chart in a certain way. And if you're born on a new moon or dark moon, it's more vata. Mangala then Mars, fire, tamas, pitta. Very different to the sun, but they're both pitta. This creates like inflammation and infections and all of these kinds of things. But at the same time, if Mars is very strong, it can create a robustness as well, absolutely. Mercury then, Buddha, is Rajas, very agitated, and it's a mixed everything. Mixed taste when we get to that. It's mixed dosha, it's mixed everything. But even though it rules the earth element, and in a way you can think about that, it's an easy way to remember this, is that earth contains all the elements, right? Space might hold all the elements, but earth contains all the elements because, you know, earth is the densest element there is. And so you go subtler, anything up from there. So earth, water obviously is contained in earth, air, fire, all of that. Jupiter is really what holds everything together, though. It's like the glue that holds everything together. So Jupiter is the guru. It's sattvic. Or sattvika. It's called. It's balanced. It's kapha. These Jupiterian type of people that you meet are very sort of hold things together, and there's a lot of cohesion and order and clarity with Jupiter. Water then Shukra. Venus rules water. It's again agitated water, though, unlike the moon, which can be, depending, more sattvic and more, we would say the moon is more like an unconditional love, for example, whereas Venus is conditional because it wants. Rajas is desire. So it again, like the moon, can be vata or kapha, and actually it's a bit of both. And there's no kind of like waxing and waning in that sense for Venus. It's always a bit of both, vata and kapha, air and water. And that usually means Venus, unlike Jupiter. Jupiter usually means a bigger bodied person, like a kapha type person, whereas Venus could be someone who is more voluptuous for sure, but they usually, as the saying goes, have curves in all the right places. So a Venus type person would be someone like Marilyn Monroe, is a good example, or Angelina Jolie. She's got Venus rising. So these are kind of Venus types. Jupiter would be more somebody on the more kapha side of it. Then Saturn is air, and it's tamas air, tamas vata, which is probably the most challenging, obviously, because vata has more classifications for a disease than any dosha, and then tamas creates problems, and then so Saturn is the problem maker really in terms of that. But it doesn't mean that without if you have a weak Saturn that you can't manage it, or even an exalted Saturn, you can't manage the energy. In fact, it means that you have to. You must. That's the key thing. And we all must, though, in another way, because we're all moving towards a stage of life that is more Saturn as we get older. Then the nodes of the moon. North node is Rahu, south node Ketu. The north node is like Saturn. It's Tamas and Vata, and it creates as many problems in a way because it's Vata. But in a way, it actually makes it even more challenging because Vata here also represents, the north node represents things that aren't easily diagnosable. So when Rahu has an influence on health in the birth chart, first of all, the person doesn't get a diagnosis and they can't treat it then. So Rahu and Ketu both rule viruses and bacteria and all of these things that get in where it's minuscule and you can't see it because you can't see the nodes. They're not physical planets. So it's anything like viruses, any kind of infections like that, any kind of thing that is just hard to diagnose. Psychosomatic conditions and things like that would be Rahu as well. Ketu is more like Mars, though. It's seen as more like Mars. It's Tamas Pitta, like Mars. And so it can create inflammations and things like that as well. So they're the planets, they're the signs. Let's bring up this now. Again, I know this is a lot of information, but if we go through signs, and again, this is in your notes, but you have the different signs, their nature. So Aries is Rajas, fiery. It's ruled by Mars. Now, this is where I'm going to go one step further, and it might confuse you. But if again you want to let this in one ear and out the other ear, that's good. But it might be Rajas, but because it's ruled by Mars, which is Tamas, the potential here is for Sattva. Because let me put this kind of in a simple way. Basically, if you have a lot of energy, Rajas, movable sign, Aries have a lot of motivation going on. But the objectivity of its ruler, Mars, hasn't really got that kind of high sattvic ideal in its mind. If we talk about the planets having a kind of desire, Mars doesn't really have ideals like other planets. So all its ideals are easily met, in other words, and plenty of energy left over. So it can be more sattvic. So that's one way of reading it. I have in here as well, again, it's all in your notes, what it rules in terms of the body parts. So Aries is the head. It's ruled by Mars. Mars rules the nervous tissue. So it rules in the brain and nerves. The brain is a nervous organ, right? It's all part of the nervous system. So we'll get into more of this as well, but I just wanted to highlight, one of those. So maybe I'll highlight one other and how it all works out in terms of, let's say Scorpio. I'm going to show you a Scorpio individual very soon when we do a case study. So Scorpio is Tamas. It's inert. But it's Mars ruled and Ketu, and they're both Tamas, inert. And you can't get anything from that except Tamas. You're going to have to really work at getting out of Tamas if you're Scorpio and very Scorpio driven. So that's how you can read it. Whereas, for example, let me see, this is another one I think that crops up a lot is Virgo. Virgo is one of the four corners. So it's seen as sattvic, as sattvika, as balanced or potentially. But, and it's a big but here, Mercury is rajas. It's agitated. Mercury is desirous, and Mercury creates too much. And then you end up in tamas. Mercury overshoots the mark every time. So it's an example of somebody with Virgo, very prominent. We all have Virgo anyway, wherever it is. But because Virgo is the natural sixth sign of the zodiac and relates to health, it's like somebody, starting off a healthy eating routine and then ending up with an eating disorder, or ending up with some issue, some tamas issue where they're not seeing clearly what's happening. So this is where Mercury overshoots the mark of sattva. So it really depends on the mix of rajas and tamas and what you end up with in the end. So I just wanted to highlight that, but without going into too much more detail about that, we can look at it in a chart or some charts. So this is what it might look like then at the end of the day. So although Aries, is seen as tamas, let me go back. Although Aries is ruled by Mars and the planet's nature is tamas, its nature is rajas, and so it ends up sattva. Taurus, likewise. Taurus is a real sattvic sign, and it's like, I was cycling earlier on and watching the cows in the fields. Taurus and the cow, obviously, all of that imagery is relevant. they're just so content with their lot. I mean, you can't be more sattvic than a cow. It's like they're just so balanced and sattvic and pure and just chill. And it's because Venus, although Rajas, has desire, the objective of the sign is tamas. There isn't a lot of objective, so there's plenty of energy left over to get all of its needs met. So Taurus individuals are usually very balanced people. Gemini can be very tamas, just like the Virgo I said, because Mercury, again, overshooting the mark each time. Cancer can be tamas also for the same reason. Moon can be balanced, but again, overshooting the mark with Rajas ends up with tamas. Leo can be more Rajas actually in the end, because Leo's ruled by the sun, so that's very sattvic in nature. And again, the objective of the sign is tamas. It doesn't have as much objective, so it gets more agitated actually, because of that mix of the sun and tamas. I mentioned Virgo. Libra, Venus is Rajas, and the sign is Rajas. You can't get anything from Rajas and Rajas except Rajas. Scorpio, like I said, is pure tamas. Sagittarius is pure sattva, potentially pure sattva, because Jupiter is, and the sign is. Capricorn is sattva potentially, because Saturn, although tamas, the sign itself is a movable sign, Capricorn. So although Saturn's nature, it might be inert, the sign's movable nature gets it going and you end up in balanced states. Aquarius, again, like Scorpio, is more tamas. These are the two most tamasic signs, Scorpio and Aquarius. And one of astrologers, Sanjay Rath in India, I remember him saying that in a class once, that wherever Scorpio and Aquarius are in your chart, those are the two areas of your life you've got major karmic debts to pay back. And you have to obviously look after those two areas of your chart, of your life, and pay the debts. And unfortunately, that's usually experienced through some sort of problem. Pisces then is pure sattva, because Jupiter is sattva and the sign is a jewel sign, the corner sign. So that is pure sattva. So let me exit from here and let's go on. I'm conscious of like speeding through all of these because I know that your heads are probably like, oh my God, this is so much information. I hope it's not too much. But anyway, remember, it's being recorded and you can listen back. So this concept is the one I want to bring in now, because if we're going to get into actually reading a chart. So you might have heard this word, prajnaparda. This is crimes against nature, I think is one translation. It's when you do something that is actually against your own best interests. So that could be eating a food that's not right for you. That could be doing something that's not right for you. Whatever it is, you could actually say even something that is healthy for someone else, like exercising a certain way, but you're doing it that's not healthy for you. You're pushing too hard, or you're not doing enough, or whatever it is. This ties very much in with the ascendant and Jupiter, and the planet that rules your ascendant, as well as Jupiter. And that is, again, because it's about intelligence. So if you don't have a strong Jupiter and ascendant and ruler of the ascendant, you might be guilty of this. And I guess everybody is guilty of this to a certain degree or other, but when the planet Jupiter is ill-disposed and the ascendant and its ruler is ill-disposed, there can be some poor choices, life choices, lifestyle choices. So these are certain houses. Every house, by the way, has an impact on health. We can't just say, separate them out. But if we just to kind of hone in on certain houses, certainly the sixth house is one that we have control over. It's in India, they call it upachaya. So it's something that improves with time, and we get better with time, and we go through our challenges and we get strong. But it is the house of ill health, and it's especially related to the ill health based on the habits that we form, based on the things that we do. So the sixth house is definitely one you want to keep strong. So if your sixth house, and by the way, the sixth house represents, you might go back to the table and see that the sixth house is all about the intestines. And Ayurveda pay a lot of attention to intestines. So for good reason, because if you're putting in lots of stuff and you're not able to take it out. Now, if you're able to take it out and detoxify, that's great. If you have a strong Agni, a digestifier, and you can eat pretty much anything, good for you. If you don't, this is going to show up as a problem in the sixth house. So that's why generally, like, it's good to have, you know, planets. For example, in astrology, Mars in the sixth house is a really strong position because Mars really creates a lot of digestive fire, you know, so it can really overcome a lot of problems. So the sixth house can create problems though, and we all have them. So we have to acknowledge them and see how they play out. Eighth and 12th are more challenging because eighth house, although representing longevity, is also alluding to the fact that, you know, if there are planets, especially, you know, impacting this, if it gets triggered in a certain way in a timing sequence, then maybe your longevity is curtailed, you know, literally. 12th house is loss, you know, so that is another indication for poor health. So if any of these 6th, 8th, or 12th especially are triggered in a time period, there can be health challenges, for example. The second and the third and the seventh also, because the second, and we're going to get into kind of different aspects here, but the second is the 12th from the 8th. If the 8th house is longevity and the 12th house, sorry, the 7th is 12th from the 8th. So if the 8th house is longevity and the 12th house is loss, 12th from the 8th is 7th. So the 7th house activations actually can create loss of longevity. Likewise, third house is 8th from the 8th. So it kind of can create this issue around longevity. And the second house is 12th from the third. So it is also seen. So this is this way of reading around the chart, and you can basically highlight these, all of these that I've highlighted here, as houses, areas of your life, of your chart, that if activated can create a problem in terms of health. So let's get into a case study. We're coming up on an hour already, so let's do something that's more interesting and let's get into case studies, and then we'll take a break for 10-15 minutes, and then we'll get into the timing techniques. So before we get into this case study section, constitution in the birth chart, how would you even look at it? Well, there's a lot of things to look at. And again, a lot of this will go over your head. That's okay. But just to know that it's a very nuanced, involved thing. Constitution in the birth chart. You need to look at the guna, or the quality, as well as the element of the rising sign and its ruling planet. So we looked a bit about that. You know, Aries, for example, is a fire pitta. It's ruled by Mars, which is pitta. It's a very pitta. But the potential is to be sattvic pitta. The end result potential. It is still rajas because it's a movable sign, but the end result is potentially sattva. That's an example. Planets in or influencing the rising sign. And so influencing we'll get into in a while. It's a more an astrological thing. So I know that might be a bit more nuanced, but basically planets look at other planets in different ways and impact different planets and different signs in other ways. So depending on what's influencing your rising sign, and planets in your rising sign or ruling your rising sign will also have an impact on your prakriti, on your Ayurvedic constitution. But also the house is 1, 4, 7, 10. So the angles. So remember that square chart I showed you? Imagine that first house was Gemini. Then the 1, 4, 7, 10 will be the four corners. Anything in the 1, 4, 7, 10 then would have an impact on your constitution. And also anything that's strongly positioned. So if somebody has an exalted sun, I mean, they're going to have some pitta there somewhere, you know? But more especially if it's in an angle or in the first house or influencing the first house. And then finally, this is a kind of quick route into seeing how you could see constitution very quickly without even looking at the chart, is what day of the week were you born? Now, just to note that in the Vedic system, the weekdays are from sunrise to sunrise. So if you were born after midnight and you think you were born on a Tuesday, but the sun hadn't risen yet, it's still Monday until the sun rises. So sunrise to sunrise, Sunday, sun's day. If you're born on a Sunday, obviously the sun has an important role to play for your health. If you're born on a Monday, the moon, Tuesday, Mars, Mercury on Wednesday, Thursday, Jupiter, Friday, Venus, and Saturday, Saturn. So depending on what day of the week you were born, hopefully you know that. Even if you don't know your astrology, you don't even need to know your astrology. In a way, you can just use this technique alone, and it has a lot of say in how you feel. So depending on the strength of that planet on the day you were born will say a lot about your health and your ability to overcome illness and your constitution and how strong you are and all of that. So If you don't know that, you might have to look it up. Some people don't know what day they were born. And you can look at that in the birth chart very quickly and see, and I'll show you now, because I'm going to share mine now, by the way. I'm going to give you my chart and show you I was born on a Monday, and show you what the moon's doing. And it's a quick fire way of seeing my constitution without even looking at my chart properly. So I will share my chart now. And the reason I'm doing this is because, first of all, I couldn't share anyone famous. I normally do famous people's charts for like different astrology subjects, but this is a bit different because we're talking about health, and we wouldn't necessarily know that about a famous person. We only know their fame. So and then we couldn't get feedback. So I'm only going to look at charts of people who are here. Okay. So by doing that, we get instant feedback as well. And that's just like as an Ayurvedic consultation, it's like that two-way street, right? It's a consultation. It's not like a one-way street. So you want to get the feedback, and you also want to kind of get into the more nuanced aspects of it. And you're not going to get that from looking at a famous person's chart, because you just know a bit about their life in the media. You're just not going to get that. So anyway, this is my birth chart. Perhaps I'll leave it for a moment. This is the North Indian here, and the South Indian on the right, which is the one I prefer, but I have the North Indian for those who do prefer the North. And I have everything lined up here and some timelines under here. I'll take any comments at this point if you want to type into the comment box what constitution you think I am based on this chart, based on anything you've learned so far, based on anything you might know already, or any comments about any planet that jumps out at you that might impact. Now, remember I said the ascendant and its ruler is important. So here the ascendant AS is Scorpio. Its ruler is Mars and Ketu. They're both Pitta. What's Mars doing? It's in Aries, it's Pitta. If anyone wants to type in any comments, you're welcome to. I'll keep going. But we can't draw the line there, because I think if you did that, yeah, you're right. Everything I just said was right. Absolutely correct. But it's just not nuanced enough. There's not enough detail in that. Scorpio is also a water sign as well. Where's the water coming in? And Venus is airy and watery. Remember I said it's Vata and Kapha. So where's the Kapha? If you knew me, you know that there's not a lot of Kapha going on in my constitution. So why is that? Remember I said that the movable signs aspect the fixed sign. So Aries is a movable sign, Scorpio is a fixed sign. So Mars is probably the strongest impact here. So Pitta. Mars here in Aries, that's kind of straightforward Pitta. Mine's a bit more complicated because I've got two rulers. Ketu also rules my sign. And so if you didn't know this and you didn't read this, you wouldn't recognize that actually I'm not just Pitta. My constitution is equally Vata and Pitta. Exactly, actually. I've been diagnosed, or not diagnosed, I don't know how you even would say that, but I've been to 2 or 3 different doctors in India, and they all said I'm equally Vata and Pitta. So where's the Vata then? If anyone wants to type into the comments where they think the Vata is, you're welcome. Do I see anyone typing? No. So Vata, oh, I can see someone typing. We'll see. I'm going to leave it a minute. And for people who are listening back to this as well, who couldn't make it to class today, it might be a helpful thing to kind of just think about it a little bit. Because if I told you straight away, you might not learn so easily. So there's definitely Pitta. Where's the Vata coming in? Okay, Douglas has seen, Douglas says, I see the Vata just by looking at you. Yes, and listening to me talk 100 miles an hour. So, remember I said I was born on a Monday? Factored that in as well. And remember I said Scorpio has 2 rulers, Mars and Ketu. So what's Ketu doing? Ketu is with Saturn, the primary Vata planet, and in a Gemini, in an air sign. So that's where all the Vata comes in. And you might say equally Pitta and Vata. And that's literally, like I said, 3 doctors have confirmed that for me. So the moon, now this is the shorthand for looking at the day you were born. So I was born on a Monday, and I'm going to look at the moon. It's in a Pitta sign because it's Leo. Leo is definitely Pitta because it's fiery. and it's ruled by the sun. So that you can see the pitta there, that's for sure. But then again, we can always go further with astrology because it's a lot more nuanced than that. And we might get into this here after the break. I put a slide in for aspects. Aspects are essentially, astrology of saying, how do planets look at each other and how do they influence each other? Because obviously the moon here is where it is, and that is in the sign Leo. It looked like it was in the star sign Leo. That's all very well and good. But that then cannot be taken in isolation because everything is communicating with everything else. So if we say that, okay, moon is in Leo, it's a fixed sign, it's going to be influenced by the movable signs, remember? So Mars is looking at my moon. Sun, Mercury are looking at my moon. And Jupiter is looking at my moon. All of these planets are looking at my moon. So why do you think I'm not Kapha? Where's the Kapha? Where's the Jupiter, for example? Jupiter is the primary Kapha. It's like the biggest planet. Why am I not bigger like Kapha? Answers on a postcard. Answered in the chat box if you have an answer. Douglas asks a good question about factoring in degrees. Yes, you do absolutely need to factor in degrees as well and look at how close that is, but we won't get into that right now. Jupiter is in the sign ruled by Saturn. Perfect. Not only that, Douglas, but actually it's seen in Capricorn. And if you go back to your notes, it's seen as debilitated in Capricorn. So physically, I don't have a lot of Kapha going on, basically. It's also a dark moon. Because the moon is here, it's waning, it's going to move and meet the sun. So that means it's waning. So that's more Vata. Jupiter is more Kapha, but it's debilitated. It's not expressing its Kapha nature. I have a Kapha nature in a kind of deeper way, but I don't have because it's rising in my Navamsha, the 9th division, for those who know that, in Pisces. So I do have a Jupiterian nature, but I don't physically have a Jupiter nature at all. Like there's no Kapha, I'm very little Kapha whatsoever. So it's a new moon or a dark moon, a waning moon, Vata, a Jupiter that's not, strong, if you put it that way. And I'm always picking up my Jupiter in a physical way. It's stronger in many other ways, in a deeper level. But in a physical way, I'm always having to take care of Kapha. I'm always increasing Kapha. And we'll get to the tastes after the break. And how do I do that? Mars, though, it's there strong. Like Mars is the strongest planet in my chart, essentially, and there's a lot of pitta, and it's looking at my moon. So I definitely have a lot of pitta as well. So that's a quick way of reading it. But there's also another way, one last way. There's a lot more always. Pitta as well from the sun. Mercury's mixed, remember. But there is this planetary aspect notion as well, which we'll get into after the break. And that's what's activated more so in these timelines or these time periods where planets get activated in our life when we start to taste a certain planet. And I can tell you from personal experience, every time Saturn gets activated in my chart, because it has a strong aspect or look at my moon, that's when it gets activated. When I go into a Saturn period, I'm a lot more Vata. I get very detached, as anyone would during a Saturn period, you might say, but I get even more so during the Saturn periods. So that is my chart in a kind of nutshell. After the break, we'll take it maybe 10-15 minute break now. After the break, we'll look at the other concept of tasting the planets, the different tastes, and how we experience each of the planets in the different time periods. And so I'm going to stop. I'm going to pause recording for now, and I'll speak to you in about 10-15. So about at latest 15:15 the hour. Okay, so let's get into the actual tastes. So rasa means taste. Rasayana is beyond obviously the actual taste of food and the emotions and so on. We're getting into the more nuanced part. But let's start with the actual taste. So you have the planets and the tastes and the tastes that correlate with each planet. So the sun is the pungent taste. So and it's made up of fire and air. Now might think of that's obvious because if you get lots of sun, it's fiery and it burns you, but then you dry out. So if you eat lots of pungent taste, if you put like a heap of pungent food in your diet, like obviously that's going to be very invigorating, but it's going to be, very, too much sun is obviously not a great thing, right? So you need to think about in quantities as well. So the sun and pungency, the moon and salty, and that's obvious as well in terms of being by the sea. And if there's anything to calm a person down, if anyone's experiencing very Mars type of issues, you just go to the sea and you feel calm in no time. So salty taste is the moon. That's more obvious. And it's a mixture of fire and water, because people maybe forget this, that salty taste is a digestive, so it's fiery and watery. Mars is a bitter taste. So you put a bit of bitter in your diet and that's great to get you going. Like people drink coffee in the mornings, but you have a lot of coffee and there's a problem. So Mars and the bitter taste, air and space, and it can literally make you spacey. Well, I know as a Vata person, I cannot drink coffee at all. I mean, again, to each their own, but if I drink coffee, I just feel completely off. Like I literally get the shakes. But I could maybe handle like taking, green tea, for example, but it's still bitter. And I definitely limit my use of that. I have enough Mars already. I don't need any more, right? Mercury's a mixed of all tastes, so it's like a well-balanced diet, Jupiter is the sweet taste. So water and earth, it's very grounding for Vata people especially, and it's good for Pitta people. Obviously, if you're a Kapha nature person and you get a Jupiter and you have Jupiter already prominent in your birth chart, then you go into a Jupiter cycle in your chart and then it transits your sign, and then you have this fondness for sweet taste, and then you put on lots of weight. So you have to be mindful of the dose. How much do you need? How much Jupiter do you need? How much sweet taste do you need? Venus is sour, fire and earth. So there's an interesting thing here about sour, because initially it will cool down. Like you put yogurt on a curry and it cools it down, but then post-digestive effect is that it's heating. And that's the nature of Venus and desire, isn't it? It's like, yeah, you have a bit of what you fancy, but then it's like that quelches it for a while, and then it comes up again, and then again and again, and it keeps coming up. So obviously we need sour. And by the way, when we look at my chart, and I showed you, I have Venus in my rising sign. I cannot get enough sour taste. I mean, it's like it's the taste I'll put on every single meal. I cannot have food unless there's lemon squeezed on it. Tomato sauces till the cows come home. You know what I mean? I mean, like I should live in Italy, to be honest with you. I need tomato with everything. It's not necessarily a balancing taste for me, but I crave it. So I'm not saying that it should be what you do, but when you have a planet rising, it shows what you're doing, likely, or what you have a penchant for. Like if somebody has Jupiter rising in their chart, they love the sweet taste, for example. Is it good for them? Probably not, because they already have a bigger body. They're already kapha in nature. So is sour good for me? Yeah, we need a certain amount of sour. Like we need, lemon is good for vitamin C and all of that. But, again, quantity is important. Saturn and astringency is more obvious, air and earth. And so it makes us more detached, and tasting astringent taste can do that for us. And again, we're going beyond just the tasting of food. It isn't just the physical thing and it's doing something to our physical body. It's doing something to our mood, our sense of self and our place in the world. If I eat a lot of astringent taste, I mean, I have a complete aversion to chickpeas at this point. But if I eat lots of astringency, I'll just feel off. I'll put it that way, as a Vata type of person. But if you're Kapha in nature, you might love hummus, every meal, right? Then Rahu. Rahu isn't classified as any taste, and Ketu either. But I'm just suggesting here that we might say that Rahu is anything that is artificial, because that's what Rahu is. So anything like genetically modified, ease, sugar, table salt, anything basically that's been processed to the hilt and you're putting into your body and your body doesn't really recognize it as food, that's Rahu. So obviously, if you're in a Rahu period, it's important that you don't eat a lot of artificial foods. Now, interestingly enough, like what's happening in the future might be around this whole lab-grown meat and all of these kind of things, and that's Rahu. But maybe that's, a more beneficial, progressive side of Rahu, because certainly Rahu has that side, but a lot of the times it has a very sort of problematic side. Let me put it that way. Ketu has no taste for anything because it's not interested in anything, so we won't give it a taste. So there are the tastes, sun through to Ketu. So when we say we feel bitter, it's a Mars experience. And so bitterness in a way is a way to get us going. If you feel angry, for example, and you're resentful or you're bitter, it's like it's motivation. That's Mars. And again, most people's experience of that every morning is drinking a cup of coffee. If we feel more detached, we're tasting the astringency of Saturn. And so again, you want to dose it and what's appropriate for you. When life is sweet, we feel blessed by Jupiter, but sometimes we feel so blessed that we might put on weight. And that's why Jupiter represents all of these conditions like obesity and diabetes and all of these things. When there are lots of choices and experiences, we're like having a Mercury experience, and that can be a good thing, but it also can be very overstimulating a lot of the time. When our juices are flowing, either creative or otherwise, it's the sour taste of Venus. So that's what gets our juices flowing. The salty taste calms the mind, an expression of the moon. And so even in astrology, you can see how the moon is remedied by Mars and vice versa. Mars is cooled down by the moon. So you can see how these work together. The dry heat of the pungent taste reflects the power of the sun, bringing clarity, vigor, and vitality. So again, these are all terms you're probably familiar with in Ayurveda, but the 20 attributes, you can look at planets in terms of these also. Is it like hot or cold, wet or dry? Saturn is obviously cold and dry and light, and all of these kind of attributes we could apply to any of the planets. And then the tissues of the body. So how does it have an effect, not just on your mood or your body, but on the tissue? And actually, when you look at the actual tissues of the body and what they correlate with in terms of the planets. So Mercury represents the plasma. The top layer of skin is the upadhatu, they call it, the secondary tissue, or lactation, menstruation. And then the waste product, the mala, is kapha. So Mercury, even though it's a mixed taste and it's a mixed dosha and it's mixed everything, when someone, and I've seen enough of this in charts to know this is true, that when someone has Mercury very prominent, like in the rising sign, they have more of this kind of a solid body type, people put it that way. You might not call them kapha in particular, but you can see there the waste product is kapha. There's definitely more kapha kind of earthiness about them, because remember I mentioned Mercury rules the earth element. The moon rules the blood, obvious reasons, and then the secondary tissue is blood vessels and tendons, and the waste is pitta. Saturn rules the muscle, secondary tissue, skin, ligaments, and subcutaneous fat, and then the waste is earwax and sebaceous secretions. Jupiter rules the fat tissue, and secondary, the flat muscles, the sinews, tendons, and that fat around the organs, the belly, and then the mala is sweat. So obviously, if you have a lot of fat, you sweat more. Sun rules the bone, and again, that's maybe more obvious because obviously vitamin D and all of that, when you get some sun, it's good for your bones and cartilage. Secondary teeth, and then nails and hair are the waste. Mars rules the nerves, the marrow, and the nerve tissue, including the brain. And then the fluid in the eyes, tears, and then secretions in the eyes. And then finally, Venus, the deepest tissue of the body, is the reproductive, called Shukra, which is literally the word for Venus. There's no distinction made in astrology and Ayurveda between Venus and Shukra, the reproductive fluid. And its secondary and most important, obviously, is Ojas, which is the fuel that all of your digestive processes lead towards. So everything you ever do, everything you ever take in, any impression, any food, anything at all, ends up either increasing or depleting your Ojas. And some would argue that you actually only have a store of a certain amount of Ojas in this life, and that you either deplete it or maintain it for as long as possible. There's different ways of looking at that. But certainly, from Ayurveda, we know that you can eat foods, live a certain way, do certain things that increase Ojas. And of course, coming back to the whole sex thing, which I go on about an awful lot, which obviously means that I've got enough skeletons in my own closet. Venus and sex means that if you overdo sex, and especially if you're more vata in nature anyway, and you don't have a lot of Ojas to begin with, and then you increase that kind of activity, then you're just depleting yourself further. So Ojas is really important. It's like your battery juice to keep you going. And then it's mala, or waste, is smegma. So they are the tissues of the body. And depending on the position of each of the planets as well, will show how these are expressing themselves. So, like, is there a problem with any of these planets? Remember, in your notes, you have our planets debilitated, are 0% strength. Maybe there's a weakness. Like, for example, I gave you my chart. I have Jupiter debilitated. What do I not have amount of in my body? And you might say, oh, look at you. I don't have a lot of fat. I cannot put on fat at all. And it just doesn't happen. I can put on muscle, if I work at it. And I do work at that. And that's literally what you have to do with muscle, because that's Saturn. Saturn rules the muscles. It's the hard worker, right? So you have to work at Saturn. Jupiter just comes easy. Some people just look at food and they put on weight. So it really depends on your Jupiter. So for me, I don't put on fat. I don't put on weight that way because of Jupiter's weakness in my chart. And actually, that's not a good thing, because if you don't have a fat layer, a protective layer, like, you're always going to feel cold. You don't feel supported, in that sense either. You don't feel protected. These are all important things in terms of the planets. So then timing techniques, let's get into it. So this sense of kala, time, and there are many different timing techniques we could use, but let's get into a few here. So if we talk about these 5 elements, bring it here. So the 5 elements can be expressed in the quality of time as well. So I talked about the 5 elements in terms of the 5 planets: Mars, Venus, Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, fire, water, earth, space, and air. But these also divide up the divisions in terms of the 5 lights, the Panchanga, they call it in India. So there are different qualities each day based on the day of the week, the solar days, the lunar day, the half lunar day, and the sun moon position, and the combination of those. And then finally the lunar mansion, the star sign. And a star sign especially has a lot to say, and the first one as well. So we'll say the first one, the day of the week, health and vitality. And the last one, air, Saturn, lunar mansion, life force, and disease. So those are the 2 main ones you were going to look at in terms of how your health is in your chart. So again, the day of the week and the planet that rules the day of the week you were born is going to say a lot about your health and vitality overall. And the lunar mansions as well are going to say a lot about how the life force flows through you or not, as the case may be, right? So the other thing to know is the times of day. This is an easy kind of way of chunking your day. You have different portions of the day that are represented by different planets. So the sun in the morning from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., Mars, then Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, Saturn, Moon, and then Rahu in very early morning. If you have an issue at any time of day at these times, you might have an issue with that planet. That's what that's saying. Like, that a lot of people wake up at this time, right? This is the Rahu time of day from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. If you're waking up at 3 a.m., there's going to be some sort of issue here. Now, you might say, okay, it's just a blood sugar issue, and so that could be it. But in an astrological sense, it's that there's a dysregulation going on with Rahu. So there's either too much stress going on, or you're placing yourself under too much stress because of some habit, or there's something Rahu type thing going on. So you can look at, what time of day do I have an issue with normally? Am I having the afternoon slump after a very heavy carby meal for lunch for Jupiter? These times of day, though, also go beyond just diet, of course. It goes into actually what is best to do. So the sun in the morning is the best to do some sort of devotional practice. Get up with the sun. Mars is good for activity. Do your best work in the morning before 12 p.m. Afternoon, yes, it could be that slumpy time for a lot of people, but it could be just a time, people just enjoy a nice big meal, and your biggest meal, ideally. That's Jupiter, the biggest planet. Mercury is, a good time to play, but also learn in the late afternoon into the early evening. Venus, if you're not with your loved one between 6 and 9, something's wrong. So you better be with your loved one, because they're going to be with someone else if you're not. So Venus in the evening, make sure you carve out some time for your partner, if you have a partner, or just to something that you love if you don't have a partner. Saturn then is when you start to clear out. And this is why in Ayurveda, they also mention you don't want to eat after 9 p.m. because the clearing out starts to happen. And this is the Saturn time of day. So you want to do as much clearing out before 12 as possible so that you sleep soundly. And then you're back in the mother's womb for the moon from 12 to 3 before, again, the Rahu kicks in and maybe disturbs you, but also it can be transformative experience as you come into the daytime again. So they are the chunk. That's a way of chunking your day, essentially. This is another way of doing it, and it's again more astrological. It's a bit more nuanced. This I have always up. So if I'm, going anywhere, I have it. If I have here right beside me, I know anytime something happens or anytime someone calls me or I do anything, I just check what is the hour, and you know that it's going to have that quality. So the hour starts across the board. You might as well start it at 6 a.m. It's probably a better way to do it. So every 6 a.m. starts with the ruler of the day. Simple as. So on a Sunday, 6 a.m. will start sun, and then it will go in order. Monday, moon, Mars, and so on and so on. And it goes in sun, Venus, Mercury, moon, Saturn, Jupiter. It goes in terms of the speed of the planets. This is something, if I haven't included it in your notes, I can send it out. But it's definitely something to print off and keep somewhere. And every time you get a phone call, like check what hour was that happened, to kind of get the quality. And also in terms of the hour you were born. If you were born on a Sunday, but it was in Mercury's hour, that will have a big say in things as well. So the days of the week, again, remember Sundays, Monday, Mars' day is Tuesday, Mercury's day, Jupiter's day, Venus's day. Think about all of these. Now, Rahu and Ketu. Rahu sometimes is said to rule Saturday evening. It's got an association with Saturn. And Ketu sometimes it's association with Tuesday evening because it's associated with Mars a lot. So some astrologers say that. Take that with a pinch of salt, I would say. So then there's the lunar day. So again, these are all just divisions. Let it go in one ear and out the other if this is too much, but some of it might land. But basically we have the lunar phases. Of course, we have 15 bright, 15 dark, and then the 15th is either a new or full moon. And so these are the elements that are corresponding. Now, even though this is not used in terms of health concerns so much and all of that, I do think it's important in terms of understanding the element. It's related more to relationships, how relationships are experienced. Depending on what lunar day you were born on will say a lot about how you approach relationships and how you go about that. You can see here that the full moon and the new moon are both airy in nature. So that's why they're both kind of more extreme, and they're not recommended to do anything too extreme for that reason, new or full moon. The difference is that full moon is ruled by Saturn and the new moon by Rahu. So certainly the new moon every month is like, you might say, a Shivaratri, a night of Shiva, and it's not ideal for auspicious activities. It's definitely a reset point in the month. And then here into the other one, because I mentioned the day of the week is a really important one to understand your vitality and energy based on the planet. But this is also in terms of the prana, the energy, in terms of the energy moving through the body. So it's related to Saturn, the overall governing planet of the nakshatras. These are the 27 lunar mansions, and they're divided into 3 sections, Vata, Pitta, Kapha. This is more so used in chart matching. In India, they would use it in terms of matching a couple so that they will have healthy offspring. And so it's recommended that you do not have the same dosha as your partner, and then you get a good match. If you have the same one as your partner, then it's not a good match. It's seen as in terms of offspring more so. So this is based on the moon's position, by the way, because these are the lunar mansions. So it's related to the moon. So if you can find that information out, you'll find out where is your moon and your partner's moon, are they in the same? Now, don't worry if your partner has it in the same, because you might not even be planning on having kids, but it's something they do consider in Indian astrology as an important factor. But in terms of the Ayurveda of this goes a lot deeper than I'm suggesting here. So the other thing you can do with lunar mansions is you can split them into 3 sections. So the first is Rajas, the kind of browny reddish color. I try to make it red here. And then the second is more Tamas. So Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. So from the first Ashwini, from the beginning of Aries, the movable sign Aries, to the very end of Cancer, these are two movable signs, Aries and Cancer. That's a division of the zodiac that is seen as daśās in nature. So the next one from the fixed sign Leo to the end of Scorpio, the fixed Scorpio, is seen as tamas, the darker color. And then finally, from the dual or balanced, you might say, Sagittarius to the end of Pisces, the other dual sign, is the more sattvic part of the zodiac. Now, that doesn't mean if I've got all my planets in the tamas dark region that I'm just purely tamas. You know, I don't think you can read it that simply, but it definitely is a tool to understand the different progressions through the zodiac. So the rajas beginning, the middle, and the end are important to acknowledge. Anyway, just giving you all of these kind of different ideas. And this is a really important one to understand, that when you choose a lunar day, and this is something I wish everybody knew going to school, that every day has a mood. The moon is in a lunar mansion every single day. It changes lunar mansion every day. And every day of these 27 days throughout the month, every day has a mood. And I know this for years of looking at this, but unfortunately, obviously, most people don't know this on the planet. If you had nothing else in astrology but use this to time something in your life, then you've been given a lot here. So if you just know a calendar or something that you can work with. So if the moon was in Rohini or any of these, for example, it's a fixed, these are fixed. That is a really good day to start something you want to be very solid and stable in your life, like moving house, like getting married, these kinds of things. You want to do it on a day that the moon is in one of these signs. A sharp day would not be good for marriage, obviously, but it might be good for dealing with some problem. Fierce also, it might be overcoming an enemy or overcoming some adversary or something, some challenge perhaps. Swift, maybe travel. Soft is definitely good for relationships. Sharp and soft, these are the only two that are both sharp and soft. It's mixed. They give mixed results all the time. And then finally, these changeable, also maybe good for travel, but also study. So again, I'm whizzing through this. I'm not going to dwell on anything too long because we want to get to your charts. So stages of life. This is where we get to the timing. So all of this is all very well and good, but like, how does it affect you in terms of where are you in your life? The stages of life are the same for everybody. Everybody goes through the first year of life as a moon cycle, a moon period, where you bond or not with your mother or caregiver. So if there's any affliction to your moon in your chart, there might be some issue here in, obviously in your life where that first year of life, there was some maybe bonding issue. The next 2 years from the age of 1 to 3 are your Mars years, your terrible twos, where you start to gain independence. My nephew at the moment is in that zone, and he's running around like you crazy, like hitting his head off things. And that age where people, children really start to play with their Mars energy. How well this goes will dictate how you live your life in terms of Mars. How well can you get what you want? Are your parents there knocking you down every time you try and get up and do something? Or are they just letting you run like free reign and go crazy? Like, it really is dependent on you and your Mars. The next stage of life then from 3 to 12 is when we learn most of what we're going to learn. Reading, writing, we go to school, Mercury years. And then we get into relationships from the age of 12. So from our teens, as puberty kicks in until the age of 32 is a Venus period where we all get interested in relationships. But it's not until after 32 that those relationships until 50 become more Jupiterian. And that means more about family for most people or a lot of people, or something more meaningful for those who don't have relationships. But either way, if you don't have a relationship, it's important that you have something meaningful in your life in that case, because Jupiter between the age of 32 and 50 is about getting married, having children, or doing something more meaningful. After 50 then, and I've met enough people after 50 who went to the sun to know that this is the case, but that's just kind of like one way of experiencing the sun. From 50 to 74 or 72, some people say, that is when we literally want maybe more sun when we retire or maybe semi-retire. But again, that's just one way of getting the sun. There are many other ways of getting the light and the energy from the sun, even if you're not in the sun. But as so many people I've met when I go to Spain and, wanted to, after 50, they started to go down to the south coast of Spain, getting more sun, It's just this need that we all have to migrate to the sun when we're older. Florida, for example. I mean, I hear that's a big thing in America, like people moving down to Florida. Then and later in life, then it's Saturn, where we start to recede from life and we start to see the Saturn energy kick in. So that's the same for everybody. So depending on where you are in those cycles, of course, it's going to have a big say on the next part, which is this part. So this is where, you know, your circumstances, the daśās are called in India, and bhukti, you know, the sub periods are going to have a bigger impact on how you feel and how you taste life. Essentially, this is what it comes down to. If you know the slide, it's based on this. So basically, because of your birth chart and where all the planets were lined up, but more especially the moon, this shows. And you could say that the moon, and remember, the moon is all about, remember I mentioned that mantra, Hare Rama Krishna. The Krishna part is the moon part, is the senses part. And how we sense things is more important than anything. How we feel our life is going is more important than how our life is going. And so when we taste life, it's really through the moon. And the moon calculated shows this division of these different planetary periods, quote unquote. And Vimshotri is this more popular one, and it literally means 120. So 120-year lifespan is divided up between the 9 grahas or planets. And each get a major division, and then proportionally to that, they get divisions within divisions within divisions. The bhukti means it's a sub-period, a subsect. So you can have a Ketu 7 years, but within that, you have, you know, some months of Ketu also. Within Venus 20 years, you'll have a year of Ketu also within all of these. So there are divisions within divisions. And so Ketu is 7 years and it's fiery, as I mentioned. Venus is 20 years, the longest one, and it's air and water, Vata and Kapha. Sun is fiery, 6 years, the shortest. Moon is 10 years, air and water, Vata and Kapha. Mars is 7 years, it's fire, Pitta. Rahu is 18 years. I'm going to show you my chart again now in timing, and you'll see how I became a lot more Vata in what I've just recently finished in my Vata years. I've just literally finished Rahu 18 years, and it's Vata, and I became very Vata. Jupiter is 16 years, and it's space, and it's Kapha. These are the elements, but we can talk about the doshas too. Saturn is 19 years and it's air and Vata. And then finally, Mercury is 17 years and it's earth. So depending on where you are in all of those is going to show what element is either, well, maybe aggravated or increased, or you might find that it's balancing you or not. It depends. And also what dosha. Transits on top of that are going to have an impact, but we're not going to get into that here, of course, because that's like an ongoing story that we cannot approach here. But the other thing about the daśās, these periods, is that when you start a period of any planet, they will have an influence on other areas of your life. And based on these, so all planets aspect the 3rd and the 10th from where they are, 25%, but Saturn does so with 100%. All planets aspect the 5th and 9th houses with 50%, but Jupiter does with 100%. And then finally, all planets aspect the 4th and 8th houses with 75% strength, but Mars does with 100%. This is important because when you go into a Jupiter cycle, you want to see what's 5th and 9th away, because those parts of your chart, and i.e. your life and even your body, will have this sense of Jupiter, of increase. That could be a very positive thing. That could be a sense of order as well. Saturn, likewise, if you're having a Saturn dasha, what's it influencing? 3rd and 10th house away from it, because those parts of your life and any even parts of your body can be impacted by Vata. And likewise, Pitta, Mars, going to influence the 4th and 8th from itself, and it's going to increase Pitta in that part of your chart. So this is my one. Don't mind sharing at all. This is on the left-hand side where I'm at right now, down here in the very bottom left. I just started Jupiter in March. So I finished 18 years of Rahu. And I can tell you, and we can look at my chart just again briefly, because Rahu influences my chart in a big way in terms of health. That was challenging in that respect because it created a lot of Vata in terms of my health. But I was able to manage it because I had an awareness of it, and I kind of balanced it out, and I kind of regimented it. I had regulated all of my system throughout. But the fact is that I did have problems for sure. And specific times within that, I had problems as well, which I could highlight. But if you go way back to when I was born in a Venus cycle, Venus Jupiter. So that's why I'm of that kind of ilk, like the teacher. Venus and Jupiter are both gurus in a way. But I would say my parents would have said that I was a bit of a, how would I put it politely? They would have said like a bit of a pudgy, we would say in Ireland. I was a bit of a pudgy child. I was a bit rotund. Let me put it that way. And they were my Venus years. Venus is rising in my chart, and so it would give me that kind of quality. Let me put it that way. But then I would have started into my sun, and my sun in my chart is in Libra. It's in debilitation. So definitely that would have challenged me here. A Venus taste, I can tell you, my childhood was a very nice childhood, very Venusian, and I enjoyed it. My teenage years, or into my teenage years, from the age of 8 to 14, not so much. Tasting the sun for me with the sun in Libra, it was a challenge because of my sun. It's in its debilitation. If I had an exalted sun, that would have been a very nice taste. That would have been a taste of confidence and self-assuredness and all of those very positive things. But all I tasted was disappointment, and very many challenging indications. The moon then kicked in when I was 14 until 24. It's 10 years. And it was definitely a changeable period, as the moon can be, but more enjoyable, I would say, than the sun for sure. And we don't have to get into the kind of particulars of my chart, but I have a sort of more detached moon, and we put it that way. It's a Kemadruma yoga. It's basically where the moon is isolated. It doesn't have planets either side. It's aspected by Saturn. I'm definitely more a loner, let me put it that way. I had that potential. Then Mars kicked in at 24, and this is where my pitta went sky high. I mean, really high. I was getting heartburn on a regular basis, and I didn't think anything of it. I just thought, well, okay, that's just what what's happening. But I ended up at the end of Mars with an ulcer. So again, this is kind of straightforward in my chart, really. But Mars is Pitta. Mars is a problem in my chart. It's in the 6th house, so it is going to create some problem in health, because 6th house, remember I said, is about health. But I did overcome it. But then the problem is that when you go from Mars to Rahu, as everybody does, by the way, and you have a problem in Mars, it could exacerbate in Rahu, and it certainly did in Rahu. And it went from that ulcer to me being, I would say, orthorexic. I'll put it bluntly. It went from me having an ulcer to orthorexic, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know what that means. It means someone who has an obsessive need for healthy eating. So it became so imbalanced in these Rahu years for 18 years that I was unwell, like particularly unwell, because I wasn't eating a balanced diet. I was, as Rahu is the case, it was bringing this block. I have it in the 2nd house of food. I was just not seeing the full picture. I was getting obsessed about food and what I needed to cut out and all of that. And so I ended up quite unwell. But it's only in recent years, I'm now in Jupiter, that I've started to come around, and I've started to actually eat pretty much anything again. Thankfully, Jupiter's come and blessing me again. And I'm like, okay, just eat what you want. And I'm not obsessing about food anymore, thankfully. And I'm enjoying my life and my food more. So that's my cycles. This is my chart to remind you why all that played out the way it did. Again, I was born in Venus. Venus is rising in my chart, so I had a very nice childhood. When I was a baby, I don't want to be like, going on about me, but my parents called me Smiler because I didn't do anything but smile. Literally, I didn't cry at all. Like, this is Venus years. So Venus is there. Then I went into the sun. The sun is not in a good position in my chart at all. It's in the 12th sign in Libra, debilitated. That's a very challenged sun. And so they were very challenging years. And so I didn't taste that sun in that way, in that pungency, in a way that gave me vitality. I only felt it as a lack of vitality and confidence, which I've had to work on my whole life, really. Venus gave me a great taste, in the beginning, but then the sun. Then after the sun, the moon, which is this in the sun's sign. So it's still a bit of a mixed bag because it's in Leo. And it didn't give all that it could have promised. Remember, I said the moon doesn't have planets either side. We don't count Pluto traditionally, and it's looked at by Saturn. And then Mars. You can see Mars in the 6th house. You know that this person is going to have some health issue entering a Mars cycle with Mars in the 6th house, ruling the 6th house, aspecting the 1st house. Movable sign, aspecting the fixed sign. So I had a lot of problems in this, including head issues. Head, Mars, Aries. Ulcer, 6th house is the intestine. I had a duodenal ulcer, literally under the 6th house. Too much pitta. And then it went to Rahu. And Rahu is said to also cast an aspect to the 5th house from it. And it would aspect by Mars. So it kind of just meant that the problems I began with in Mars became exaggerated in Rahu. And so I became very obsessive about food, 2nd house, and eating a certain diet and eating a certain way and so on and so on. So that is my constitution in a nutshell. Let me take your charts now. So I'm going to take a pause and we'll do some case studies. But before I do that, for those who aren't here live, I just wanted to mention that if all of that was over your head, you can go to this book that I've written, Cosmic Bodies. Most of it is in that. And I'm hoping that this will be an ebook soon enough, because I'm finishing the 2 books I'm working on at the moment. And then once I have them finished next year, hopefully I'll make this into an ebook and it'll be easier to get your hands on. And the other thing you could do is check out this new website that I have called Vayuveda. I'm combining astrology finally with yoga and movement practices. And this is like my passion around, well, everything. If it doesn't have astrology in it, I'm not interested. And that's why I had a real problem teaching yoga for years, because I taught yoga for 10 years, but I just, after 10 years of teaching, I got really bored of it. And I'm like, what? It's like a dog chasing its tail after a while. So when I brought the astrology into it, though, I then started getting enthused again. And I feel like this is the way to go for me. So understanding the different concepts, I'll be releasing a video for patrons soon on the theory behind this. I recorded a class last year and I've edited it recently. So it's like a 1-hour introduction to this concept of Ayurveda. And I'll be doing more classes in the future. So that's something for those who are not here live who want to check those out. For everyone else, I'm going to do some more case studies. And for everyone that's listening back, thanks for listening. And until next time.